So I've got my still life kind of set up. I backed up the shot so you can see I've got a lemon and a pink grapefruit. Now the nice thing is while they're analogous colors, that means they're close to each other on the color wheel. Yellow and this kind of orange, pink, relatively close to each other on the color wheel, but when I get into some of the middle and darker values, I'm going to get into more reds on the grapefruit, a little bit more yellow greens on the lemon. Red and green are complements. So they can set off some strong contrast, because complements, while yes, a complement dulls the other color when you mix them, when you just put a complement next to its complement, like red and green, for example, it intensifies both colors. That's called simultaneous contrast. So keep that in mind about complements, because that can create a really strong, interesting contrast. Okay, so we talked about the lemon in terms of color. Now let's talk about the grapefruit. I've mixed the obvious. First of all, I've got kind of an orange, pink. It's basically an orange with a little bit more towards the red side, And then for my lighter areas, I added more yellow. And how do you get an orange? Color-wise with hues. Well, you mix cadmium yellow and cadmium red. You don't mix alizarin crimson and lemon yellow. You get mud. So that'll give you a good orange. If we want to push that even a little bit warmer, we can add a little bit more cadmium yellow and push it warmer. So we have light tone here, middle tone. I got some more middle tone here. How am I going to push it darker, cooler, and duller? So darker, well, I could add more red, push it a little bit more towards red. How do you make orange cooler? Well, it's orange towards red, so the natural direction to move in terms of temperature, in terms of cooler, would be kind of towards red-violet. So I'm going to add a little bit more red in, a little bit of blue to kind of push it towards red-violet. At the same time, a red-orange, that's what we're dealing with, a red-orange, its complement is going to be a green-blue. So you want to mix the green-blue, right? And then maybe also mix kind of a red-violet to kind of also push it cooler, darker, and duller. Again, the blue-green or green-blue, that's going to push it duller. And we're also pushing it cooler by adding some red and just a little bit of violet. Okay, so I've done that. Let's go over this again for the grapefruit. Kind of an orange pink, that's my strong color there. Lightened it with a little bit more cadmium, right? And then as I darken it, I'm adding a little bit more red and a little bit of violet, red-violet, to kind of push it a little towards violet, make it cooler. At the same time, you might dull it a little bit with the complement of this red-orange. The complement of red-orange is green-blue. So add a little tiny bit of that there, and then a little bit more here, and I get more of a brown. If you wanted to push it even cooler, you could add some more blue to get maybe a cooler spot in the shadows. But this is a straightforward gradation right here. Now for the fabric, basically I'm going to use a cool gray for the shadows and a warmer gray for the lighter shadows in the fabric. Okay, so I got two grays here. One kind of warmer, cooler. Got my yellows. Pink grapefruit will be. This is kind of, you know, I've been doing like the grays for a couple weeks now. This is looking kind of trippy. So, ought to be fun. Don't worry about, you know, messing things up. You can always just start again. So kind of relax before you start, and you want to kind of move quickly from the beginning. Okay? Think about, you know, not using too small a brush at the beginning. Something that you can really move paint around with. Now remember, we want to try and break things up fairly simply. Light and shadow. Get a strong sense of light and shadow first. Move around. So, let's start. Keep in mind, as I mentioned earlier, you want to start with like your strongest saturation. So, that area is kind of here with the lemon. I want to leave myself a little bit of room for a highlight, the weight of the paper, right? So that strongest yellow is going to be kind of the transition area between light and shadow. Goes around the whole thing somewhat like that. Okay. And again, in the beginning, like we've talked about, we're mostly kind of working wet on wet. I'm going to put down my next yellow that I have on the palette. You know, create a quick gradation. Just move it from the palette to the paper in a way that makes sense. Let's go a step darker, okay? And we might stop there for the time being. We'll go a step darker. Fill that in. I know it's going to be even darker here. There's a strong shadow right there, right? So, yeah, I could go a step darker. Just a little bit to kind of keep that strong shadow, the sense of it there. Right? Now, I didn't forget about that center, but I kind of wanted this to dry a little bit. I'm going to go back. Kind of get around that part of the lemon, whatever we want to call it. I don't know what we'd call it. I don't know what a good name for that is. It's not really a stem. You know, I don't know. But basically, we're getting some color in here. You know, I might even see a little bit of white kind of popping off there. I did kind of cover up all the whites because I turned a couple of lights off, so I don't really have strong lights. It's a good idea to leave some white though. I would kind of chastise myself for that. I'm gonna go a little bit darker. You got a really dark in there too. But yeah, again, if I had a chance to do that again, which of course you always do, but I would probably leave some white in there. Leave a little bit of white highlight. It just got a little lost. Now you can kind of soften edges if they got a little bit too hard too quickly. Just soften them. You'll come back to it, you know. Then we're going to do the same thing for the grapefruit. We'll put kind of the most saturated color down first. This is a little bit lighter. This is pretty saturated. Very saturated, right? So we'll kind of go into our most saturated areas here, and we'll work with this and that lighter color. Move around pretty quickly. Make sure you have plenty of paint on your brush. Plenty of paint. And I want to be able to move it around easy. Easy. Just like that. So as we go around over here, it's staying pretty light. Now I'm gonna go maybe a step darker while I'm there. We'll see how that reads. We're probably gonna have to go darker still, but we'll put down a little bit of a darker tone there. Same thing down at the bottom. Right? I haven't forgotten about the middle. And you know, a lot of watercolorists that strictly do watercolor, they have a tendency to get real formulaic, real predictable. It's natural, because there is an unpredictability to watercolor, and that's like the beautiful thing about it, though. We don't want to take all that out of the process, but people do. People try to make things predictable as much as they can. And I didn't leave any white there. I'm going to leave a little bit of white here, just in those areas for now. And, you know, we can come back to it and play around with it. Now let's go a step darker even. See how that looks on our grapefruit. So we do have some really dark darks over here. And again, for an object like this kind of color, your dark actually, it could start to go a little bit towards violet. I think to a certain extent, you want to follow what makes sense theoretically, but you can also take a certain amount of cues from what you see, you know. I see a little bit more stronger color here I'm gonna put in. It's just fading away a little bit. And we'll take a little bit more water, using the same color with a little bit more water and a little bit more water, just so it kind of spreads out and into what's already there. Alright, so that gives us a real basic, and it's funny, there's like a red spot there right here, a little bit of red. I'm gonna put that red spot in just like that. Now I kind of want these edges to be somewhat dry before I start to go in around them, but here's the thing that we've talked about. This is kind of setting up your basics, moving over the whole composition, not getting hung up on one object, one area. That's what we're doing right now. Well, I let that dry, and now I'm going to go in. Kind of going to work back to front, and we'll go with that cooler gray first, and I'm just gonna fill in basically where I have a lot of empty space. And this is kind of probably good for everybody to see just how I'm handling a larger amount of space like this. I'm going to use plenty of paint, right? And again, you want enough paint down there that you're kind of just guiding it. It's not too much of an effort, you know? You can add some water to kind of make it even easier. Right? We don't have to worry at this point whether we have the exact value, you know? Got plenty of time, but getting mid value down, getting down something that maybe is a little bit cooler than the objects also. That's important at this point, you know. The other thing is that we'll talk about space that's kind of further back like this, you know. This is behind the objects. We'll talk about that more, but basically you don't want to push it too dark. I think we mentioned this. I think we talked about this, but you don't want really hard edges anywhere kind of in the back of your painting, because you don't want someplace in the back of your painting to pop forward. And when you create a lot of contrast on one edge, say like right here, you know, right where I am, if I made this super dark, you know, really dark, this edge reads almost white, maybe some white in there. I'm not going to leave white, but that's the kind of thing where you don't want this edge popping up. What I mean by that is the stronger the contrast on an edge between the two sides, the more that edge is going to kind of separate, and usually the lighter part of the edge will pop forward. So in other words, this would pop forward. Well, it's something kind of in the rear of the space that I'm painting. I don't want it to pop forward. So you gotta limit really how dark you go. I can push my dark a little bit maybe up here towards the edge of the painting. But actually, a lot of this edge, where that background space meets my towel, I'm gonna keep pretty soft so that towel sits down and I don't have anything popping forward. That's important. We'll talk about it more and more, but that is important. Another thing you'll notice in my painting, I'm sure you've seen it in yours, but pigments are funny things. Not funny haha, but funny peculiar. And you will see, especially like ultramarine blue and sepia tend to separate a little bit. I can see that through here. You might have noticed it, especially actually if you have good pigments. Good pigments will separate. Hey, just the way they are. So I'll let that dry, and then we'll kind of move to the front and go back from there with the grays. I'm going to paint some of these warmer grays now, and as you do this, you can always drop some darker gray in. I just want to get some light and dark down in the foreground. Try not to get too meticulous too early, but maybe just the larger shapes. And where you need to, as you're doing something like that, if you need to drag an edge out so it's soft, get used to doing that. It's pretty easy. Just get used to doing that while you're moving around. You can also remember, you can wet an area, and after you've wet an area, put the paint down. Let it spread a little through that area. Okay. And I'm gonna go through here too. And again, take the paint off my brush, take a wet brush, drag it out in a couple of places. And that's generally where I actually work a little bit harder to kind of move the paint around, is when I'm working with maybe not much more than a wet brush and a little bit of pigment. Particularly, when you're working with something like this, again, like we've been dealing with, that's white or very high key. You're going to use the paper a lot, and you want to kind of get used to dragging that paint out, or pulling, as it's called in a lot of circles. I'm going to put more water down here, kind of almost all the way up to there. Then watch, we'll drop a little bit of paint in. Drop a little bit here, a little bit back here, and let the paint do some of the work. So I'll move around. Eventually I'll get back to this back edge make it kind of softer, but I don't want to do that until that dries, because I don't at this point want them really bleeding into each other. So this is a little bit further along. I developed the still life areas around the objects, the drapery, mostly just going around with a cooler gray and a warmer gray. You can see the warmer tones, especially closer to the front. Notice in the back that I have cooler grays. Also, I made sure really very little of those edges stood out. They all sit back, and again, I might see stronger edges. I might, here and there, see a pretty strong edge. If I painted it exactly the way I see it, it would pop forward a little bit too much. So, now what do I do? Well, now it's going back into each object, putting down some darker darks, getting a little bit more specific. I have spots where I have to pay particular attention to. Here's a spot here. That edge on the lemon, and it looks like a pretty hard edge there as well. It stands out a little bit too much. And again, it's one of those things that I think you learn to some extent with experience, but you don't want that edge to be that hard. Around the rest of the edge, there's places that you do want it to be a little bit harder and kind of assert the edge to be in front of the background, but there's places that you want it to be softer, particularly where there's less contrast, maybe along here. So it feels like the edge is going back into space. Again, the edge has to, in a sense, contradict itself. It has to look soft, like it's going back into space, and it also has to assert itself in front of what's behind it by being a harder edge in places. So you do both. Now here with the grapefruit, this is a real important spot. I have a shadow right underneath of it. I have a shadow down at the bottom of the grapefruit, but I have reflected light at the very bottom, which creates kind of a strong edge down here. Am I going to paint it as a strong edge? No. This is where I kind of need to show that the object is sitting on the surface right here. So I got to soften that edge with a dark on both sides of it. Maybe I'll show the reflected light a little bit more through here. The rest of the edge, as I said, there's places where maybe you want it to be soft, like here. Maybe it'll be a stronger edge, places like here. Remember the parts or the anatomy of a gradation. You have maybe some reflected light, the core of the shadow, and so on. My highlight is here. So let's see what I can do going a little bit further, okay?